Thank you all so much for joining today. The topic of our webinar is adjusting to a new location. Now, a further welcome to everyone to be joining here. We have folks dialed in to the call as well as those in the room, so we appreciate you all attending. And want to get some housekeeping items out of the way since we do have a mixed group here. If you can submit any questions in through our email address or the chat function in this webinar, then we'll be able to answer them here at the end. Now, to give a bit of a background on who I am, this is me. I'm Andrew Bruzy. I'm the founder and CEO of Vendium Global. So always like to give a bit of background of the presenter that you're going to be listening to and why they're worth listening to on the topic. So I'm an author in the mobility space as well as leading Vendium, which I'll go through a bit about what we do here in a moment, but have just over a decade of experience in the mobility field. And considering the topic of today's conversation, also want to bring up a former expat and also a traveler. So I passionately travel. I try to visit new countries every year, further exploring into new areas, want to share those experiences with you. Now, as far as what does Vendium Global do and what do we do as a company? First of all, we are a global mobility and HR consultancy firm, and we do things a little bit differently by taking a very data-driven approach to any of our client support. We're headquartered in Northwest Arkansas, and we focus in on helping usually large to medium companies in adapting their global mobility program to achieve what we refer to as mobility modernized, really finding a balance between the technology, the tools, and how to help manage the people, including things like training and situations like this, a webinar where we can share feedback of people that have actually been there and crossed those borders and had those hardships and how we can help to make sure that others don't have them in the future. Now, this is not a cultural training per se, but since we are talking about adapting to a new area, you cannot talk about that without referencing culture. So the most simplistic version that we could boil down culture to is the collection of shared norms, values, and beliefs in a group. Now, if you think about everything that goes into that, there's religion, there's food, there's experiences, all of those tied into one. And for those that have attended the webinar that we had on crossing cultures in 2020, we do a much deeper dive into that. And I don't want to do that in this session today, but again, want to call out what culture is. So as we go through the remaining slides, that you're looking at that in the same frame as who am I? How do I adapt to others? How do others adapt to me? And part of this is the coconut versus peach that we have right below there. And I really like this symbolism. If you think about what a peach is, it's soft on the outside and then you end up getting into the shell that's on the inside. This is a culture that is most commonly referenced when talking about Western culture, especially specifically US culture. And that's because we will have a very soft exterior. There's a gentleman that I happen to be friends with that was originally from China. He brought this up to me and I had no reference of this, even in working in the global mobility and cross-cultural space, that when Americans will go up and say hello to someone, they will very commonly say, "Hi, how are you?" They're not actually asking how you are. It just is a common greeting. Now, in the cultural lens and how you shape things, he interpreted that as that is the full greeting. So he would pass me in the hallways and say, "Hey, how are you?" and walk right by. So not even the obligatory pause, which I thought was kind of funny, and how people will try to conform to another's culture in that regard. A great example on the flip side of it is the coconut culture. Now, these are going to be much harder to get into. So they won't seem as warm. They're generally described as cold, while peaches will be described as warm. So a peach culture, again, has many more of the emotional tie-ins that you feel like you're interconnected with the person from just meeting them. But if you want to figure out what's at the core of the person, it's going to take you much longer. As far as the coconut, when you first meet them, you may not be invited to social gatherings and you may have a little bit of a harder time making friends. Now, as soon as you break through that barrier, though, that's where it gets very soft. And you'll notice that you make much more meaningful and long-lasting connections at that point. And when I mention here of social interaction, this is the driver of any difficulty that we have in adapting to a new location. If you think about what would be the challenge that you would have. If you picture yourself in a new area, or if you have experienced this, or if you're experiencing this right now, the challenges that you face are almost entirely social. It's because when you go into an area, they may not like the foods that you like. They may not have the same manners that you have, or have the same customs that you have. Again, back to the norms, values, and beliefs. When you look through your cultural glasses and those are the norms, values, and beliefs that you see the world with. If you think of why we have these items, because we are social creatures as humans, we adapt and we evolve and we connect and we get things done because of our social interaction. So when there's a breakdown of that, then we feel like there is something wrong with us, and we have things like culture shock. And with that note, to go through what culture shock is. Now, culture shock here, put in the Webster Dictionary definition of it. I'll break it down a little bit. The feeling of disorientation experienced by someone who is suddenly subjected to an unfamiliar culture, way of life, or set of attitudes. Now, if you think about every piece of this, it really just goes back down to feel uncomfortable in an area because you're looking at it through those cultural lenses. Again, picture wearing glasses and however you see the world. There's an expression that we often hear of looking at the world through rose-colored glasses, and everything with that, it seems far more beautiful because you have that filter. So whenever we go out into the world, we are experiencing the world in a cultural filter. A great example of this is if you travel even regionally throughout your own country. I'll use myself as an example, where I grew up in Connecticut, so right outside of New York City, and I specify that because I adapted a lot of culture from New York City. But I also grew up in a town of about 3,000 people, so very tight-knit, close, but the city was very close to where I lived in proximity. And then afterwards, I moved around the US and I've moved several places internationally, but I often joke the largest culture shock that I've experienced has been moving to the southern US. Now, I mentioned that we're based in Northwest Arkansas now, and a great cultural norm here is that when you walk down the street, people will just say hello to you. Now, if you go to a Nordic country, let's say, and you say hello to someone, they're probably going to be looking at you and pause for a moment because they believe that a conversation is going to continue. In the New York area, I remember always hearing that you will want to wear nice shoes because everyone is only staring down at your feet because there's so much information, so many people walking around. And this is the same for many major cities around the world. There's just too much to stop and say hello to anyone. If you think of if you would sit for a moment in Shanghai and greet every person that passed you, you'd be out of breath before you finish the block. So this is just a very small piece of how humans interact, and when we're looking at it through those cultural lenses, just to be cognizant of that. Now, for our first exercise, any of these webinars are really just a one-way conversation, and I want you all to be able to experience some of these things and feel them rather than just hear the word. Now, when was a time that you felt culture shock? And I know this is a very general question, but when was a time that you went somewhere, and this could be even locally, could be that you went to a social gathering of someone from a different culture and you just felt out of place? Now, these are very common, and they could happen in small ways. It does not need to be any massive event or a deep state of depression, and hopefully it never is. But if you have experienced something where it just wasn't framing up with your normal way of interacting, a great example of this is how people will greet each other from different cultures. Do you greet with a kiss? Do you greet with a hug? Do you greet with a handshake? If you greet with a handshake, how firm do you grip the hand? Do you bow? What about exchanging business cards? Do you bow when you exchange a business card? Do you just put the business card in your pocket? These are much more detailed if you want to figure out where you're going into. So let's say if you are, I keep mentioning bowing, so I'll use Japan as an example. If you go into Japan and you exchange a business card, it is proper etiquette to bow when accepting. And you'll look at the business card because the business card is a representation of the person. Now, the person that you're interacting with may experience a form of culture shock if you just take that business card and pop it in your pocket. That may be normal to you, and you may be looking at them wondering why they're examining your business card so much. So this is just, again, one small example of a small piece of how culture shock can impact our lives. Now, because culture shock is so closely connected with where we're going to be moving to and whenever we're moving. Now, I keep wanting to reference that this is not just crossing a border. This could be moving within even the same region of your country. Because people are different everywhere, and because culture is a group of norms, values, and beliefs of a certain area, that a certain area, a certain town, a certain city, a certain municipality may have different customs than you, and it's something for you to be cognizant of. So you'll see how this graph here kind of goes in a wave. And that is truly how culture shock happens. And some of these spikes are higher, some are lower, but ultimately, most people will experience every one of these steps. And I'll go through here what they are in more detail momentarily. But if you look at the baseline there, the dotted line, that's just kind of your normal base point, where you are if you're just at home in your home culture. Then any spike above or below that is going to be your emotional state when you are interacting with that new culture in the new area. First on there is the honeymoon phase. And this is obviously the most exciting, and hence the graphic of people dancing there. It's almost like you're on vacation. This may be even occurring if you're on a business trip, or if you end up taking an expat assignment somewhere. Your family can experience this as well. Everything is new and exciting. And here I specify that it's in a good way, because new may seem scary. Different may seem scary, but this new and different seems very enticing and just captivating because you're living in it for the first time or adjusting for the first time. Hence, honeymoon phase. If you think of this post-marriage, everything is beautiful and exciting and seems to be going well. When we mention here that there's so much to do, part of this is because you're distracted. You're distracted from having to adjust, and you're distracted from the differences in their detail. You are spending time figuring out where you're going to live, what you're going to eat, what you're going to do, maybe adapting to a new job, all these types of things. So you are very, very busy at this point, which is good, but something to look out for, especially when you bring a family, and I'll use an expat assignment as an example, because the employee in the family may adjust at much different rates. Typically, the employee will adjust faster because they have a secondary culture, or in this case, I suppose a third culture within the workplace. Their place of work has its own culture, own norms, values, and beliefs, and safety net around the employee. Meanwhile, the family, they may be staying at home, trying to figure out how to socially interact, spending time exploring the area, going to the grocery store. These types of things that will end up having a harder time adjusting because they don't have the immediate support system. For the point of everything going well, this is where you, to use the example I used before of the glasses, you're looking at the world through rose-colored glasses because everything is falling together as it should. Even if there's a problem, this is the highest level of support if you are on an expat assignment or if you are adjusting. The team is trying to make sure that you adapt well. Your relocation management company is taking care of any of your needs. You have a lot of people that are supporting you, and you have yet to be kind of pushed out on your own. Now, as soon as you do start to have some of that support structure wane, then you can enter into the stress phase. And again, I keep referencing that there are expat assignments that apply to this, but it also applies even if you're just moving yourself. So please do not get too focused in on any specific point that I mentioned when I'm talking about international or domestic, wherever you may be, because they all apply. And even if you are doing this with or without a support structure, because again, ultimately, the wave of the culture shock graphic still applies in most scenarios. The stress phase can be summed up in a, can you believe ... fill in the blank. It could be, can you believe people stand in line this way? Or people interact in a certain way that you're uncomfortable with, that they dress in a certain way, that they have certain expectations of you. An interesting thing whenever you are going through the stress phase, and this is to kind of pull you back if you can bounce up and not enter into the depression phase too much, is remember that when you are in a new area, you are the one that's different. I know that sounds odd, but the more we can be introspective is the more that we can help ourselves adjust to this area. Everyone that you are seeing in your new area, they have all been there already. So when you are assessing where they are coming from, when you're assessing what their norms, values, and beliefs are, again, from the cultural aspect, then you are assessing it from your lens. So just be cognizant of that. Then the reality of the differences begin to set in. This could be when you go to the grocery store and they don't have the items that you like. I keep mentioning food, but if you think about how important food is throughout our day, food is a gathering time in a way that we gain comfort. If they don't have items that you are used to eating, or a great example, I spoke with a lady that had moved, and she was in a grocery store and not able to find cleaning products that she recognized. And this wasn't even a matter of not being able to speak the language. It just was different brands and different wording. Now, that was an interesting thing to hear that, because it was a cultural frame that I had not experienced, because again, we spoke the same language and we seemed to have a lot of similarities, but a very small thing to kind of destabilize the home environment. Now, as far as the customs or manners, they may seem annoying. I know that sounds aggressive and a bit brash, but it's when you are interacting with someone, and when I mentioned the greetings, a kiss on the cheek, was that outside of your cultural norm, and did they just invade your personal space? What about if they reach over and grab your hand and start holding your hand like they do, embracing you as a friend in some Middle Eastern cultures? They may view that as inappropriate or violating their personal space, making them feel uncomfortable. So a lot of it has to do with flexibility and knowledge, which we'll go through momentarily. Then you can end up finding it difficult to make things feel normal, because you don't have that sense of routine when you go to the grocery store, when you hang out with your friends, when you spend time with your family in the places that you normally spend time in. Then you will notice that without that frame of normal, things start to destabilize a bit. Now, this is the most negative part. And when I keep referencing destabilizing, that's when you're entering into the depression phase. This is where you'll hear statements like, "I miss home." You'll hear this from your family. You'll say this yourself. You start thinking about very specific places, very specific things that you enjoy doing that you cannot do in your new location. The differences can seem overwhelming to you because they are so different, and because you can't regain that sense of normalcy. You have a desire to return home, to return back to what is normal. Now, this could be very scary, and this could seem overwhelming. If you are moving for your place of work, then you may notice that you're not performing as well. This could be very scary, and I'll reference expats again if you end up moving to a new area. I'll use South Africa as an example. If you move from South Africa into the United States and you said goodbye to your friend, you sold your home, you got rid of most of your belongings, and the rest of your items just arrived, and you're going through the boxes to unpack that. Now, think about this frame here, and think about, again, when you go to the grocery store and things are different. You can't go to the same restaurants, your friends aren't there, your family is so far away, and you're not even in the same time zone to communicate with them. This can seem extraordinarily overwhelming. And now, couple in, while you're feeling so overwhelmed, you're not performing well at work. This is the duty of managers and any people leaders that we have in today's session to adapt to these things. We want them to recognize if someone is moving into your area, even if, again, it's across town, then they may be going through a depression phase, and it's time to give them a little bit of support and a little bit of leeway in that regard, because they are going through something that can be very traumatic. I often reference the 3 most stressful times in someone's life are death, divorce, and relocation, and that is because of the destabilizing nature of all 3 of those. For the second exercise of what would you do or what have you done in these scenarios when you felt the depression phase setting in? And for anyone that's moved, for anyone that's attended university, for anyone that's experienced something that's fundamentally different from how you normally interact with the world, I can almost promise that you felt some kind of depression phase in your life, because these are things of how we adapt as animals into these social environments, because what is different socially will make us feel like we are in danger. It's an animalistic trait that we actually feel as internal workings of emotional creatures and as an animal, that our life is at risk. So we'll have a longing to return. Now, this will give you an idea of what someone in a similar situation is going through. So we went through the negative. Now let's go through the positive. And this is where you start to see the uptick on that wave, where you're now kind of adjusting. This is called the performance phase, because I'm getting used to this. The very first statement on that bullet there. And you're becoming used to the differences of the culture. You're setting new routines, and this is one of the tricks to adapt well, is you are in a different place. Again, whether or not it's even across town or if it's across the world, you need to set new routines and new structures for where you are. Where do you like to go out to eat? Where do you like to recreate? What do you like to do? These are all things that you need to start to form in the new area, because this is your foundation. If you consider Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, these are the base human needs that will allow us to ascend beyond that. So what you were used to in your home culture was you were at the top of the pyramid, and then you fell down all the way to the bottom, where you went to essentially survival mode. At least that's what it's feeling like. So now that you're back into the uptick of this and you're building those foundational steps, then you can embrace the differences of the culture, because this is starting to become the new normal. You have a new sense of confidence. And I often use a statement that competence breeds confidence. You are newly confident because you are more competent in the culture, in the new area, in the new place, because you have those foundational items, because you know where to go for fun, where to go for places of worship, where to go for shopping, all of the structural items that we take as granted. If you think of the term for granted, we are taking things for granted, literally as granted, that they just are there all the time, which they're not. So the moment that they're not, that's when we start to go into the stress and depression phase. The moment that we can start to rebuild those and reframe those items that stressed us before, that's when we can begin to perform. Now, for the normalization phase, this is really when you have adapted to the new area. Now, you have three options when you're entering into a new culture. You can confront it, you can complain about it, or you can conform to it. The goal would be to conform. And the lessons of today's webinar are around the conforming to the new culture, because if you confront it, that's when you're going to be aggressive and you will not be able to adjust well. If you complain about it, that's when you'll stay in the depression phase, because you'll just view everything else as wrong. And as I mentioned before, you are the one that's different in the scenario. So adapt to where you are and recognize and appreciate the differences. It's important for you to maintain who you are culturally, but that does not mean that you should take away from your time adjusting into that new culture, because the value comes from you moving into the area and making sure that you perform and adapt well. That's what you should do for both you and for your family and for your team. Now, in the top bullet there, it's I am home. This is something that you'll say where you may ask people to come visit you in your new home. And even for expats that may be there on a temporary assignment, it actually actively feels like they're home. Now, the differences begin to seem like the new normal. So now the old way of doing things will almost seem odd, because you are adjusting well. So the timing may differ on how long it takes people to go to these phases. And many times they will go back to other ones when they adjust and notice something else different or have another additional issue. And this is perfectly fine and perfectly healthy. It's important to recognize that these are phases that you'll be going through, and you're never going to be stuck in one of them. There is a new excitement that's formed. So if you remember back on the graphic, this is where the uptick really starts to head above the line, because you are performing well. Your performance evaluations are coming back in. Your family is adjusting well and they're happy. Your children are making new friends in the new school. So everything seems beautiful once again, and you're almost back into a semi-honeymoon phase. Now, this was not on the stages of culture shock graphic, but this is important to note, especially for those that are just in a certain area on a temporary assignment, because this is a reality. Another step, which we refer to as the return phase. And this can be a scary thing, because there's an expression from an author, Thomas Wolfe, that you can never go home again. And this sounds very scary and, again, depressing and emotionally trying, right, when we hear these things. But it applies in this situation, because when you go back home, everything will be different, because you've been gone for a period of time. And this doesn't matter if it's been 6 months, a year, 3 years, 5 years. Everything will be different. There's going to be new scenery, new businesses, new people around. The stores that you went to, they may not have the same employees anymore. Same thing with the restaurants that you enjoyed. Your friends may have moved away or continued on with their lives and maybe in a different phase, where you have to recognize that, again, in being introspective, that you have changed, and often so have they. This has been a period of time that you've been away. And again, that's not a bad thing. It's just, if you are expecting to return back and have everything in a time capsule and never changed, then it could be shocking. And I'm not saying that, again, in any kind of aggressive way. It's by nature, we will remember how things were. So since we remember how they were, just as you remember how to get home when you drive home every day from your place of work or school or wherever you may be, you know how to get home. Now imagine if you were driving home and that road had changed. That's going to be shocking to you. You won't understand why. And in many cases, this is a literal truth, where some of the infrastructure may have changed. So there may be a new way to actually drive home, something that seems so insignificant that we take as granted that could be changing. Now, another item that we often don't look at, and that is so important specifically for expats or people that are on a temporary assignment, is that your workplace will often change. Your workplace is one of your cultures, as we mentioned, and a place of safety and security and normality for you. So if your workplace has changed because there are new leaders, they may have gotten new desks or new computers or new people or changed buildings, something like that, then you are going in expecting it to be as it was, or potentially you're expecting something to be changing in your favor that doesn't. For instance, when returning back from an expat assignment, a common complaint is not receiving a promotion upon return. And this is a talent management gap that many companies have, but it's something to be aware of where there should not be something assumed when you're returning. And the overarching theme of today's webinar is being flexible in these areas and recognizing that you cannot go with a fixed perception of what you're going to be walking into or what to expect, because I can promise you it will be different. Now, for the third exercise is, have you experienced reverse culture shock? And that's often what this is referred to, where you can experience this even if you take a long vacation somewhere and return back and you just see that everything's different. It doesn't feel right. A great example of this is if you go to a country that is vastly different than yours, and let's say people will drive differently, something again so simple that when you return and you're noticing how people drive, that will seem odd and that will seem inappropriate because you started to adapt to the new area. You started to conform in those three stages, which is positive, but just something to recognize when you return. Now, as far as the symptoms of culture shock, there are very many of them, and they often resemble things like depression. And we put depression on here as one of the traits because it does apply. These are things for you to watch out for in yourself, in others, and your family, and potentially your employees, where you'll experience a sense of resentment. This often happens in the place of work, where you'll feel like if you're the employee that moved into a new area, that they did not tell you everything that you needed to be told. They did not prepare you properly. They did not train you properly. They didn't give you the tools that you needed to be successful. And this was typically going to happen in, again, those lower stress and depression phases. You may want to recluse and just kind of stick to yourself. And this will lengthen your time in those lower stages because you're not adapting well socially. As we've mentioned, the social interactions are going to be what make you exceed and excel in your new location. You'll experience anger because you don't know why you're feeling these things. You may notice this within your family, your spouse, your children. Spousal anger and move can be one of the leading contributing factors of a failed assignment or a failed move because they don't have the support structure that the employee does. So if they're at home and they're trying to find a job and they're trying to regain their normal, and you come home and you just worked all day and you walk through the door and you're so stressed from both the new job, the new culture, the new ways of working, trying to adjust to the workplace, and then you just want to go in and go to sleep, and your spouse is saying, but what about me? I've been here all day. Where have you been? I need some kind of interaction. So your social interactions at home are one of the most important things to make sure that you are taking care of. And when we reference the halo horn effect on that bottom bullet there, that is when you either view things as beautiful and wonderful and that there could be nothing that goes wrong or that everything is terrible. This often happens when you're thinking back of your home culture, that everything was wonderful there. Why did we leave? And here, everything is terrible. There's nothing good. Now, those are very scary things, and they can happen in the reverse as well. So it's something that you want to be aware of and cognizant of, that it's not all good or all bad. There's a little bit of good and a little bit of bad in every situation, and it's mostly just your perception and how you react. Now, when we're thinking about the areas of which we interact, these are an oversimplification of where we go. So we're going into our homes and our home environment. That's where our family is, things like that. That's really where our safety net is. Our places of work, where I mentioned that we have our own cultures there, places of education, this will often apply to you if you are either a student or if you have children that are in school, where you recreate. This is going to be things like nightlife or going outdoors on a hike or whatever you like to do for fun. And then also the day-to-day. I'll go through these more in detail in a moment. Now, for your home environment, these are questions that we pose to kind of check in and see how that structure is, because your home environment often often use the symbolism of a keep in a castle. And for those who are aware, the keep is the strongest structure of a castle. It has the thickest walls. It was designed where in the event of something going terribly wrong, then you could go back into the keep and it would be the most secure area. If you think about the same thing of when you're moving into a new area, then your home is your key. It is the safest place that you can be in, and that is where you need to build the most structure around. You need to make sure that your family is happy and check in with them. You need to see what foods you're eating because that makes you connect back with your home location. That's a very simple way for you to have a sense of comfort. We often hear the expression of comfort foods, and that's a real thing. How you eat shows how your culture is and shows how your family environment is. Then what contents differ in the home. That's important to note because if you have something that you really appreciate, it could be something silly like a specific chair that you like to sit in. The more that you can bring from your original home into the new, it will make it feel more like yours. It'll make it feel more like that safe place that you can go back to. And how does your routine differ? And this is important because I mentioned that routine is going to be the way that you can build as much structure and regain normalcy in the new area. Now for exercise 4, think about this because this is one of the items that we take as granted. How structured is your home environment? Do you have dinner at the same time every day? Do you eat the same types of things? Do you stay in certain areas of the house? I often joke about this specifically in US culture, where we typically will have larger homes. And it's interesting because humans can only occupy the amount of space that we physically can. But if you think about the areas that you interact with, that is your key. That is your safe place. So if you go from the living room to the bedroom and the kitchen, that's the only place that you go into, but then you may live in a 5,000 square foot house, that's a funny thing. You are noticing your safe places and you want to have those same safe places in the place that you're going to be moving to. So as far as the workplace is a secondary safe place for you when moving into a new area. You want to make sure that your cross-cultural communication is well-tuned, and well-tuned specifically for where you are. You're interacting with people that may, again, speak the same language as you, may even be from the same country as you, but they will communicate different. So you want to recognize the differences of how you interact behaviorally. You want to know what the expectations are of you because the easiest person that we can change is ourselves. You want to be a student and learn what expectations you should have of them. Kind of mirror what they're doing, see what they're doing, and don't charge in too quickly into assumptions because when you're assuming things, then you may assume incorrectly. We all want to adapt well and we all want to do a good job in our places of work and be praised at the performance that we have. So if you are a student, then you'll know what performance standard to seek to accomplish. Then also understand that workplace cultures may differ. This is a great example if you are moving from the same company to a different location with the same company. Again, it could be within the same country or it could be crossing borders, but just because your corporate culture was one way in one location, it may be different in another, and that's okay. It's something to just be aware of when we're adapting. Now, whether or not you are a student or if you have children that are in school, recognize that schools will vary wildly. There will be different schedules, different curriculum. And I say here that it could be either ahead, behind, or different. And this could be based on your grading structure or what classes are presented. There could be different lengths of time. And even in an international standpoint, and I'll use an American school as an example, even if you're going to an American school internationally, it does not mean that's going to be the same, and often it will be different. And a big piece of what makes it different is the people that are there. So if your child is used to interacting with certain students that may look very much like them, that may interact very much like them because they came from a homogenous culture, the homogeneity comes from not just looking the exact same way, but we have two different examples of people. So diversity ends up bringing difference of appearance and difference of mindset. The difference of mindset and culture and everything that goes into that is what we value in diversity, and that's what often happens when traveling to a different area. The difference of appearance often has very little to do with the difference of the person. It's where did they come from? If you have people that look vastly different but grew up in the same household, they're going to be very similar. So just be mindful of the difference of mindset and difference of culture. Then also how language can differ. Even if you speak the same language, your slang, idioms, and context will differ. How you say things, what you mean by things. Something like sarcasm is a great example of this, where certain cultures will use sarcasm very loosely, and that you'll say something, but quite literally mean the opposite. Now, if you think logically, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense that we do that, but it's a social tool that we use, that it actually builds camaraderie amongst us. So just be aware that how those will differ, because when you are doing things like if you're a student and you're writing an essay, you want to make sure that your cultural voice is being heard in the frame of the person that's listening, that their cultural lens can pick up what your painting consists of. And also, we keep mentioning social, but it's so important that new friends will be made. That's when you're going to adjust the most, and that's when your child will adjust the most. Now, recreation, because we are not all work, we also want to play. You'll experience different outdoor adventures, exploring the nightlife. Dating. Dating is essential in the new area, especially if you, well, actually only if you are single. So those that have families, please do not date. But it is something important to note of how cultures will date. What are the normal courting practices of wherever you are? How do people go on dates? What's a normal date in the area? And again, this is something that we take as granted because we're so used to our culture. We're so used to our home. We may have people from any corner of the globe listening to this webinar, but if they considered a perfect first date, that definition may vary wildly. Also, sports may differ. This is a great example. I had a lady that we're supporting with a client that's coming into the United States, and she was very frustrated that she couldn't find a place to play netball. And for those that know, it is not basketball. And so many people in the US were trying to encourage her to play basketball, but it was not. It was netball. So those types of differences in your hobbies, you want to make sure that you have access to them, that you can either bring them with you or find the closest thing to them in your new area. Now, for the day-to-day, and I use the grocery shopping example, but that is so important because those types of creature comforts will make a big difference in how you build up that foundation in your new location. A great example is I spent some time in Colombia, and culturally, Colombians don't often eat a lot of spicy foods. I personally love spicy foods. So I was going into grocery stores and trying to find things like jalapenos or hot sauce. And so I was having a difficult time finding it. I thought that it was funny because it just was a difference of palate. That there are other Latin countries that will very much enjoy spicy, but is a great example of how you cannot lump people together just because of shared language. It can vary wildly, even if they're just a country over. Now, as far as paying bills, this is kind of a funny thing to think about, but if you think about how you pay your taxes, how you pay your light bill, how you pay anything that you do on a day-to-day basis, we often don't even think about it, but that can make such a difference. In socializing, I don't want to beat this in too much, but how we make friends and what is a normal social interaction? What's the expectation in a social interaction? A great example of this is how do you say goodbye in a party? Culturally, I'm used to saying goodbye in a party to anyone that I know and make sure to take the time. In other cultures, they may say, why are you interrupting me from a conversation just to say goodbye when you may see me tomorrow? So just those things to be aware of. And then also in performing any kind of task. And this is just the catch-all of anything that goes through your day-to-day life. Now, the crux of it, of how do I adjust well? And we've used examples of the types of interactions that we'll have. I want to really sum it up as we close this. Seek training. Now, the very top bullet here, this is a great example. Brain is your very first shelter. Years ago, I took a survival training course where we went 5 days out in the middle of the wilderness and we were given no food and no shelter. We had to build everything ourselves. And the biggest thing that the instructor kept referencing is that your first shelter is your clothing, the thing closest to you. So don't worry about putting a roof over your head as we're used to. You want to make sure that your body is warm because that's your immediate shelter. That's what's actually going to keep you alive. Your brain is your first shelter when interacting in a new location. You want to learn the language because language has so much meaning, even beyond being able to communicate. It will show you some of their cultural background. You can hire an intercultural trainer to come in and train your employees. Train the employees that are interacting with people that are coming into their culture and train the employees of people that are going into a new culture to make sure they adapt well. Learn about the new area and culture because that will help you adapt faster. When you know their norms, customs, their values, and beliefs, then you will know how to interact with them. Then also in learning adjustment technique, you won't be able to know every fact. These are cultures that are very well established, that may have been there for hundreds or thousands of years. So you want to make sure that you are flexible as a person and that your family has the tools and techniques to adjust well. And when you're thinking about those tools specifically, you can use things like cultural training and journaling tools. Many of these are electronic that you can go in and watch videos and spend your time in doing this, where you don't need to meet with an intercultural trainer, and often they're much less expensive. I reference journaling because a good intercultural training tool should have a journaling function with it, where you're checking in with yourself. You're seeing what went well, what did not go well, because you do not want to fall into the halo horn fallacy where you start to view everything as negative or everything is positive, because it's not always positive. And if you keep wanting to return back to the point where everything was perfect, it never was. So you want to recognize the good and the bad and how you're doing throughout it. Then you want to connect back to your home culture. And communication tools are very important. Video call your family, video call your friends, interact in ways that you can build as much normality in your life. This is very important in order to build that kind of structure and build those foundations, because you may be in a different area. And this may sound like a kind of cheesy analogy, but I often use the term the distance between hearts, not the distance between people. So just because you may be physically away from each other, it does not mean that you cannot stay interconnected. Use translation software. It'll help you interact with people. And the final bullet there is Google. I use this as a funny example where you have every single answer to every single question that's ever been asked at your fingertips every single day. Use a search engine and do your research. If something's making you feel uncomfortable, if you don't know why someone is doing something in a certain way, don't just view it through your cultural lens. Figure out why they do it, or figure out if that is normal, or if you just may be interacting with someone that may be culturally different from their location. Now, as far as strategies to adjust, you'll want to make new routines. I've mentioned this a couple times. Your routines are your structure. It's the base point of that Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, where you know what's normal, you know what to expect, you know when you drive home what the road looks like. You want to have as many roads that you recognize, and I don't mean that literally, I mean that figuratively, that when you are going into any scenario, you want to have as solid of a foundation throughout it. And part of this is you can see a therapist. Many people, especially in Western culture, and especially Western men, to use as an example, they'll view seeing a therapist as a point of weakness. View it as almost intellectual program, that you are seeking cognitive enhancement. You are untangling all those items that may be stressing you out. It will take you longer to figure out on your own with a professional. If you wanted to build a house, sure, you could figure out how to do it on your own. It's often better to hire a professional to have them do it for you or to guide you through it. Make new friends, because your friends are going to be your social structure in your base point of what's normal there, and leverage and foster your support network. Your support network is going to be everyone from your family to your friends to your coworkers to everyone that helps you along the way that, again, we often take as granted. And take a moment to think about who those people are. And even today, tell them that you appreciate them, because they really do make a difference, even in your day-to-day life right now. I want to thank all of you for joining today. Here, you'll notice our email address, so support@vendiumglobal.com. as well as our website, where you can ask us questions anytime, or we also have a learning section that will post this webinar for anyone on your team that has not been able to attend or that you may want to share it with. See that we're right at time, so I will go ahead and sign off. But again, further appreciation for all those that have attended, and you all have a wonderful day. So thank you again.